Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to St Mary's Cathedral here in Limerick, in Ireland. And it's a very, very great pleasure to be able to speak during this year's Edington Festival online. I'd like first to thank the Dean of St Mary's, the Very Reverend Niall Sloan, for allowing me to use the Cathedral's webcasting facilities so that this talk can be streamed to you live. It's also being recorded on the same link, so if anyone you know might like to see it, or if you want to go away and come back, etc., then it should be available to you afterwards as well. I did think that it was much more appropriate for a talk about Edington to come from a fine medieval liturgical space such as this, rather than from my living room. I'd like also to thank everyone who gave me such great help and support during the 6 years that I was director of the festival. A few names will crop up here and there during the course of this talk, but to all of you, you know who you are, and if you're out there listening, thank you again. So, a view from the Festival Pew. I should perhaps just explain to anyone unfamiliar with the Festival Pew is located towards the back of the church near the door through which everyone comes. Often the director will sit there, members of the festival or the festival admin team, often sitting, as I say, in the pew or nearby. It's a good position in practical terms because you can welcome visitors and guests and deal with anything arising that needs the director's attention, but also in aesthetic and musical terms. It gives you a great view of the church. You can see the whole service unfolding in front of you, and a very good view of the choirs, and of course also good sound. Note please that I've called this talk a view from the pew, not the view from the festival's pew, because every person who's been to the festival, whether as a participant or a visitor, will have their own thoughts and memories of the festival. And these are just a few of mine. This year was to have been the 65th festival, and hopefully it will be possible to commemorate that milestone another time. But I'm actually going to take us back to the 40th festival, as that was the first time that I visited Edington. So that makes it 25 years since I first attended the festival. As I will explain shortly, my first year as an active participant at the festival was actually a year later, in 1996. So from my perspective, next year in Edington parlance could therefore be termed a Blue Nun year. I wonder if significant anniversaries are still marked by the giving of a bottle of Blue Nun. Who knows? Anyway, my first visit in 1995 was for a Tuesday evening, and it was actually a BBC recording as it happened that night. I'd been becoming increasingly interested in church music and liturgy, particularly after having the good fortune to study with Paddy Russell at the Royal Academy of Music in London as a student on the church music course. I had first heard of Edington, however, as a boy, as several chorister contemporaries of mine had been to sing as part of a nave choir. Of course, a tradition that continues to this day, 2 boys from a number of different collegiate and cathedral choirs there for the week. So I already knew it was something very special. Although I couldn't possibly have imagined that in just a few years I would be directing the festival myself, maybe it was no bad thing that my first encounter of Edington was as a visitor. This is, after all, how many people come to it, as a member of a congregation. I remember almost immediately thinking how much I would love to be part of all this, and although I knew a number of the key figures in the festival team already, I wasn't quite sure how I might be able to get involved. You can therefore imagine my surprise and delight when I received a phone call from the then director, Andrew Carwood. A vacancy had arisen unexpectedly for the festival organist, so would I like to play for the next festival? I think several people, including Paddy Russell, had tipped off Andrew that being part of a festival would be right up my street, and so it turned out to be. So I arrived in 1996 to play the organ at the festival. The festival organist inevitably works most closely with the nave choir, as they sing the bulk of the accompanied repertoire, and also you're sitting, of course, right by them at the organ there. Playing particularly the old festival, or playing the old Edington organ, I should say, was certainly hard work, as those of us that did will be able to testify to. In fact, it was a great workout for the organist at times, with the pulling of the stops and the pressing of the combination pedals, usually all at the same time, and trying to watch the conductor, and maybe even play the right notes. However, I quickly realized that this proximity to the nave choir did bring with it a very considerable benefit. It gave me a privileged ringside seat from which to observe two very important things. I could see the festival and its liturgies unfolding day by day, how it all ran, something of what goes on behind the scenes, and so on. This turned out to be valuable preparation for when I was later director. I also had the opportunity to watch the late David Trendle working his musical magic on the nave choir. I particularly relished the unaccompanied pieces that David did with the choir, as I could just sit back and luxuriate in the rich sonorities that he was drawing out from the printed page and from the singers in front of him. I recall in particular rehearsals and performances, including a BBC broadcast, of the mighty unaccompanied double choir setting of the Evening Canticles by Gray in F minor. And I recall also David's stylish and sensitively shaped interpretations of large-scale bird motets. At the same time, I began to develop an appreciation of why Edington, for a church music lover, is essentially a week of bliss. An intense week of rehearsing and then presenting a wide range of the sacred music repertoire in services, not in concerts, in a meditative atmosphere, therefore. One little scene from that time has stayed in my mind, and for me, I think it captures something of the essence of Edington. It was the final evening of the festival of the following year, 1997, the Saturday evening. And as it happens, it was to be my last evening as festival organist. I knew, along with just a small number of others at that point, that this was to be Andrew Carwood's final festival as director, although, of course, we were delighted that he stayed on and took over conducting the Scola, and I'll refer a little bit to that later on. So just myself and a few people knew that I would be announced as Andrew's successor the next day. His was certainly going to be a hard act to follow. Andrew has great warmth as both a person and a musician, and the ease and assurance with which both he and the then administrator Patrick Elwood ran the festival was impressive. So for me, this was a timely moment for reflection. That evening, Consort had sung Gibbons's wonderful verse anthem, See, See, the Word is Incarnate, for Evensong. They'd performed it beautifully, as one would expect, under Jeremy's direction, and it had been a joy, as it were, riding on the coattails of that performance, accompanying them on the organ. One of the solo singers, the alto Robin Blaze, I remember heading outside with him after the service to listen to Compline from just outside the Priory Church, lying on the grass in the churchyard and staring up at the night sky and the stars, and talking to Robin in between listening, of course, about the delights and sometimes also the challenges of performing. That, for me, is really an exemplar of the essence of Edington in a nutshell, if you like. The beauty of the place, the beauty of the church, the beauty of the music, the atmosphere, and at the center of all this is the sense of friendship, fellowship, and collegiality, and that permeates the festival, as those of us who've had the privilege to be there know, in every area. It was, after all, of course, from a friendship between a clergyman, Ralph Dudley, and a musician, David Calcutt, that the festival sprang and almost immediately took root. So it was with trepidation, but also excitement, that I took over the role of director and began, fairly swiftly, to make plans for the next festival. Just about the first thing to be done as director is to choose the theme for the festival. This theme, of course, can be very wide-ranging, but from it will spring the choice of liturgical material and readings, and the choice of maybe a theme for each day, and of course, clearly, therefore, the springboard for many of the musical choices to be made. As it happens at that time, I'd also had to begin to scout around for a new festival administrator, as Patrick Elwood had said to me that he was needing to finish up over the course of the next year or two. But it's typical of the way that people who work at the festival think of a festival, that they give you that sort of notice and they're aware how important the succession is going to be, so they don't just drop you in it, as it were. It was actually David Trendle who came to the rescue here. Himself, of course, another former director of the festival. So I think he appreciated the crucial importance of having a good administrator as much as any of us did. So he came to the rescue by suggesting Peter Roberts, a former member of his choir at King's London, who I also happen to know myself. So happy days. And of course, Peter continues to serve the festival to this day. So, with a theme in place and the administrative succession on the way to being secured, the next thing was to meet with the choir directors and choose the music. I don't know if you still have fireworks. I mean literal fireworks, not metaphorical ones. We will park those for a minute. But I don't know if you still have actual fireworks on the last night of the festival. But I remember those festival meetings with the choir directors being a bit like that, in the sense that as director you would light the blue touch paper, stand back and watch three very intelligent and lively musical minds sparking off each other, from which would come all sorts of wonderful ideas, wonderful musical choices. And I guess it probably ended up being about 25% each in the final selection of music, give or take. It really was a huge privilege to work with these guys. So if we now move on to the opening of the 1998 festival, on the first day of the festival, apart from informally welcoming singers as they start to arrive, the first formal task of the director is the opening speech to all festival participants, about 60 or so people. I remember, not surprisingly, being a little nervous as I was stepping out to do this for the first time in front of them all. But equally, I remember the warmth coming back at me from everyone seated there in front of me. I felt this groundswell of support, and that gave me quiet confidence inside that all would be well and that this was going to be a good week. One of the first things I noticed over the course of a week was the tremendous goodwill that there is towards the festival, which of course remains very much the case to this day. And that really gives you a boost as the festival director. People wanted you to do well and to succeed, and they would give you the latitude in which to experiment, try things, and do things to some extent your own way. You felt you were plugging into a great generosity of spirit, not just from the participants, but from the village, the visitors, and the wider community. One of the joys of Edington, I think, is that it gives the best possible demonstration of why teamwork is so valuable and effective. Everyone involved there has a unity of purpose and objective: to run and to have the best festival that is possible in any given year, and to enjoy themselves doing so with lots of like-minded people. I think probably back in my mind sometimes it was kind of my job to make sure everyone else was having a good time. I think that was often just back in my mind. During the festival, I also myself received much encouragement personally. I think we're all aware of the importance of encouragement, particularly of young people, as they're making their way in the world. And this is something that Edington has always stood for and celebrated. Pretty much everyone responds to a bit of encouragement now and again, the same way that pretty much everyone responds to kindness. And I found that when someone said just a little word or two to you, a well-chosen comment or compliment, an expression of appreciation, all this made an enormous difference. Particularly so when perhaps one of the choir directors, I was fortunate that I'd known Jeremy Summerlee a long time. I'd known, in fact, the longest of the three choir directors of that time. And as I've already alluded to, David Trendle and Andrew Carwood were both, of course, former directors of the festival, and both there now very much in the conducting capacity. So to have these three chaps there conducting the choirs was this wonderful reservoir of knowledge and of experience of a festival, and that was a huge benefit. I must say I was extremely lucky during my time as director to have that as I was starting out on my first festival or two. Over the course of a week, as well as being moved and touched by people in this way, we're all naturally also frequently moved by the music, and that was certainly the case for me. But you can also be touched and moved in more unexpected ways. A thought-provoking and elegantly constructed sermon, perhaps. The calm dignity of the liturgy, so well celebrated. And for me, when I've had the pleasure to visit the festival since, for a service or two, I find just the start of the service, or maybe I should say literally the join between when the service is about to start and when it starts with the procession, I found that moving quite frequently. The morning Eucharist, when you have the sequence of the acolytes moving down and standing ready, waiting at the back, perhaps slightly nervously holding their candles lest the draft blows them out, particularly as the door opens. And I think especially if it's going to be a rousing first hymn, you can feel the organ building towards that hymn in the improvisation introduction. And the last thing is you hear the characteristic click of the latch of the west door opening and the choirs process few. And I think maybe, perhaps as director, if you're sitting in that area, maybe even in the Festival Pew, if you're sitting there, you just see this huge number of people go past, you know who they all are, they're all part of a festival musician team, and that's a special feeling. And I still feel that when I'm there, even though, of course, a good number of years since I was involved personally. But of course, we shouldn't neglect the fun side of a festival, the silly and the unexpected. In the festival, as in life in general, it helps, I think, to have a sense of humor. I came across a nice little quotation by, in fact, none other than Billy Graham, but he says that a keen sense of humor helps us to overlook the unbecoming, understand the unconventional, tolerate the unpleasant, overcome the unexpected, and outlast the unbearable. I rather like that. Now, I hasten to add, much of that didn't occur in Edington. I can't think of very much unbecoming, probably a little bit unconventional going on, I'd say. Nothing too unpleasant, I don't think. Certainly nothing unbearable, but definitely things unexpected. We did our best, I think, to avoid errors in the festival program, which of course many of you will know is known as the Companion. So it's a printed booklet you can buy at the beginning of the festival week. Although there was the occasional deliberate mistake, such as a spurious name, Julian Smallbones, or two, in the choir personnel lists, but I do recall one genuine error when an unfortunate chorister had been listed incorrectly. The boy in question gently, just a little plaintively, but most politely, pointed out to us, "The thing is, my name's not Brian, it's Simon. Brian is my dad's name, and you see, I don't like the name Brian, and neither does he." I remember a sung requiem when the setting was the famous one by Gabriel Fauré. The place was absolutely packed full. About 650 people there, sitting on side altar steps, sitting absolutely anywhere they could find a nook or cranny. And there were even people standing outside listening, I remember. And the then festival treasurer, the late Jeremy Moore, wrote me a post-festival note in his very elegant script about the festival finances, saying that if a festival ever found itself in a spot of financial bother, put on a Fauré requiem. I remember a time when another festival, Jeremy and somebody, of course, managed to miss the whole of the morning service. It wasn't until some years later that I learned of the unexpected impact of something I'd said to him without thinking really after the incident. He had turned up, parking his car, I seem to remember, very near the Priory, right up against the wall, maybe an effort to look and show us how he'd been really trying to get there in time, but had dismally failed on that front. He was expecting, I think, a bit of a roasting from the director. But I think I just expressed my disappointment in some way and said that I was looking forward to hearing the consort's motet that evening. Jeremy later told me that he found this approach much worse than a straightforward telling off. The director doesn't usually conduct very much, so he has the opportunity to talk to festival visitors, take in how things are going, maybe a little bit of reflection, and of course be present at various meetings and gatherings during the week. But it also means that he's available as a useful spare pair of hands, if you like, whether as organist or conductor. And this aspect came into play on the Friday afternoon of my first festival, just as we were heading into the closing weekend. In those days, the cricket match between the choirs took place on the Friday afternoon. All was going terribly well, and play had just resumed after the tea break, when the youngsters had fizzy drinks and ice cream, and the adults something a little stronger. Jeremy Summerlee and his team were in the field, and he had taken his canned refreshment back with him out onto the pitch. At the end of the over, as the fielders switched positions, he leant over to pick up his can, and he seemed, from the distance where I was, as though he just fell to the ground, and he began to writhe on the ground in pain. We all thought this was a joke, but then we realized he actually really was in a lot of pain, and he was injured. This quickly became defined as being a sporting injury. It turned out that he'd actually managed to break the smallest bone in his foot, and it was obvious he was going to be out of action for the rest of the festival, and that I would have to take over conducting the consort for the remaining few days. Down for the service that evening was Ligeti's Lux Aeterna. If you don't know it, it's a complex piece for 16-part choir, and I didn't know it either. With the match being followed by tea at 5:30, and then the rehearsal 6:30, and an 8 o'clock service, that didn't give me a whole lot of time to get to know it. One of the things, having slagged Jeremy a little bit, but one of the things I admire greatly about Jeremy is his ability to distill a precious and entirely practical kernel of musical good sense, a nugget of advice, into just a few words. And as he was limping off the pitch, his parting words of advice to me for the Ligeti were to beat with just one hand and use the other hand to show the beginning of each page, so that the singers had a marking post from which to stay on track. Come the service, the Ligeti was at the offertory. Well, we all got through that relatively unscathed, I think, and I think I managed to get my hand coordination right. Apart from the music itself, I have to say, and this is where the humour comes in a bit, I have to say that I actually found the biggest challenge was keeping a straight face at the sight of the basses coming in at one point as instructed in the score in falsetto. I must confess that remains one of the most extraordinary visual and oral experiences of my career. Then, later in the service, during communion, it came to a wonderful Schütz motet, Das ist je gewisslich wahr, which we were also doing in consort. This I knew well, and such was my relief at that point, that at the glorious closing Amen, totally spontaneously and without thinking, I stepped around the music stand and headed towards the sopranos in order to draw out the maximum juice from that final cadence. I think I rather scared them, as they told me afterwards that they had no idea what I was going to do. This quickly became known as the Barley charge, and I think I can probably still do it. You get the idea. At a subsequent festival, I was the one to experience a painful occurrence as a result of a barley charge of a different sort. The last night of the festival culminated in the final of the pool tournament. Once again, I don't know if that still happens, but that's what happened in those days. And this was at the time also when it would be followed traditionally by the singing of the Von Spiro song, and those of you from that time will not need any explanation of that, just a rather fun song which would wrap up any mishaps from the festival in a suitably hilarious way. I must say the liturgical origins of the Von Spiro song and the transmission thereof could profitably be researched afresh someday, perhaps. So this event took place in the upper room in those days at the Lamb pub, where the pool table was. Now that year must have been a particularly spirited rendition of the Von Spiro song, and I was getting extremely carried away, sort of half galloping across the room, which was fairly full. And the next thing I knew, I felt quite a sharp pain in my posterior. It turned out that all the shenanigans had frightened a dog who was up there, and he attacked my behind. Now, if you've ever been bitten on the rear by a dog, I can tell you it is surprisingly painful. And to use a very apt quotation from the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 78 that I used at the time, I had been smitten in the hinder parts. Well, I've enjoyed looking back over my time at Edington, and I hope that you have too. From this, I've realized how much the festival encouraged me to develop, both as a person and as a musician, particularly when you consider the diverse skills that one needs ideally as a church musician, obviously as a performer and musician, but also as an administrator, and also as an educator, the teaching and training side of a role. And I hope that Edington Festival has done the same for many others, and will continue to do so long into the future. I was interested to read recently in an article by the Vice President and Registrar of a third-level institution here in Ireland that the skills most prized by employers in 2020 are being a team player, the ability to think and act creatively, and interpersonal skills such as communication and adaptability. It's interesting to notice just how much of this comes as part of what we might call an Edington education. Although inevitably the passing of time has given me a slightly different perspective, my affection for the festival remains utterly undimmed, as does my gratitude for the opportunity and the chance to work with and alongside so many people. And in the case of my musical colleagues, to work with people with such great personalities, great character, warmth, and fine and refined musicianship. So thank you for tuning in, and particular thanks to the current director of Edington, Richard Pennell, for the opportunity to present this talk to you as part of this year's virtual festival. Thanks again to the Dean of St Mary's for allowing us to use this space for this purpose. I thought it would be nice to finish on a live music note, as it were, so I'm going to play a couple of organ pieces. By all means, don't feel you have to stay and listen, as it were, but if you would like to, then you're welcome. So 2 pieces of about 6 or 7 minutes each. The first one is by J.S. Bach, and it's Schmücke dich, o liebe Seele, which is one of his famous 18 chorale preludes of the so-called Leipzig chorales. Very typical chorale prelude where you hear the right hand in an embellished melody, the chorale melody, and then you hear lovely contrapuntal accompaniment in the left hand and pedals. And then the second piece is a rousing march. It comes from the 3rd Symphony of Charles-Marie Widor. Widor wrote many symphonies, of which the most famous is clearly the 5th, with its toccata at the end. But this march is a very fine composition and shows the beginnings of Widor maturing from his early, more sort of bombastic style to a more considered style later. So, once again, thank you for listening, and I will pop across the organ and play you a couple of pieces.